Welcome to the Biblical Wisdom Channel. This story takes place 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. Israel faced monumental challenges that went far beyond ordinary battles. The Promised Land, won through immense effort, was now surrounded by enemies, while God's people lived in times of doubt and fear. It was during this period that a giant warrior emerged, capable of making even the bravest men of the time tremble with fear. He was notorious and infamous for his swift and brutal destruction of his enemies. His name was Goliath, the Philistine giant. His name remains known and spoken about by countless people across the globe, even to this day. What's even more intriguing is that he wasn't alone. He had brothers who were also violent and deadly warriors. The Bible presents this giant as a warrior of extraordinary proportions, someone who wasn't just strong, but utterly terrifying. But who were these giants? Did they appear out of nowhere, or did they carry a deeper, more profound mystery? Perhaps what you've never been told is the connection between Goliath, his brothers, and the enigmatic Nephilim, figures mentioned in Genesis who continue to puzzle scholars and believers alike. Before diving into the heart of this content, I kindly ask for your support. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this message. This act of love will help spread the gospel and touch more hearts. Goliath the Terrible. When we think of Goliath, the Philistine giant, it's hard not to picture a figure straight out of a fairy tale or an ancient legend. But he was real, just as real as the fear he struck in the hearts of the Israelite soldiers. Standing over 9 feet tall, roughly 2.7 meters, Goliath towered like a human fortress on the battlefield. His presence was overwhelming, not just because of his size, but also due to the psychological impact he had on everyone who beheld him. This man was the perfect embodiment of physical strength, dominance, and arrogance. The Bible, in 1 Samuel 17, provides a detailed description of Goliath, leaving no doubt about his imposing stature. His armor was a spectacle in itself. Made of gleaming bronze, it weighed about 57 kilograms, approximately 125 pounds. To move with such ease while wearing it required extraordinary strength, something only a man of colossal proportions could possess. It was as if his armor was an extension of his body, making him even more formidable. On the battlefield, every movement he made caused the sun to glint off his metallic breastplate, blinding and intimidating his opponents. But it wasn't just his armor that made him stand out. Goliath wielded a spear that seemed impossible for an ordinary man to handle. The shaft was as thick as a weaver's beam, and the iron spearhead alone weighed 7 kilograms, 15 pounds. Now imagine the scene. Goliath holding this spear as if it were a mere toy, effortlessly and skillfully, while his opponents struggled to lift their own weapons. Additionally, Goliath had a shield bearer who carried an enormous shield ahead of him. This shield bearer wasn't just there for protection. His presence amplified the image of Goliath as an unstoppable force, an unapproachable power. Goliath was no ordinary warrior. He was the Philistines' champion, the embodiment of their power and invincibility. His towering frame and booming voice made him more than just a soldier. He was a psychological weapon. He didn't need to fight to make an impact. His very presence was enough to paralyze the opposing army. Every step he took shook the ground, and his roars echoed across the valley of Elah like thunder, taunting the Israelite army. Imagine being there on the other side, hearing those roars. How would you have reacted? To the Israelite soldiers, Goliath was a giant, but he was also a symbol. He represented fear, doubt, and the overwhelming sense of inferiority when faced with an apparently unbeatable foe. His 40 days of challenges, mocking Israel's army and the God they served, were a direct provocation to their faith and courage. How could such an imposing man be defeated? He seemed invincible, but Goliath had a blind spot. Like many who place their trust in their own strength, he underestimated the power of faith, the strength that comes from God, and the determination of someone who fights not just for themselves, but for a higher purpose. And that's where the story begins to shift. Because while the Israelite army quaked in fear, there was someone being prepared to face the giant, someone who would not be intimidated. The scene is of a vast valley separating the armies of Israel and the Philistine army. On one side, armed but uncertain Israelite soldiers stood, gazing at the horizon with apprehension. On the other, the Philistines, brimming with confidence, were led by a colossal figure who would make anyone hesitate. Goliath, the giant, was not merely a warrior. He was a living weapon of intimidation. For 40 consecutive days, he stepped out from his ranks and advanced to the center of the valley, thundering his voice into the ears of the Israelite army. "Why have you come out to fight? Choose a man to face me. If he defeats me, we will be your slaves. But if I defeat him, you will become our servants." These words, recorded in 1 Samuel 17, were not merely a taunt. They carried a devastating psychological strategy. Goliath did not just aim to defeat Israel militarily. He sought to humiliate them, reducing their courage to dust. Can you imagine being in that situation? Hearing his voice echo, seeing his massive figure silhouetted against the horizon, and realizing that no one on your side dared step forward? Goliath's challenge was not a typical fight. It was a representative duel, a tradition where the outcome of a single battle would decide the fate of an entire people. But in Goliath's case, the proposition was anything but fair. He was a giant, a man armed to the teeth, trained for war from his youth. How could anyone face him on equal footing? That was precisely what he wanted the Israelites to believe, that the battle was lost before it even began. And what happened? The Israelite army froze. No one dared raise a hand or even look directly at Goliath. King Saul, who was supposed to lead his people, was also consumed by fear. Do you see the irony? Saul had been chosen as king in part because of his stature. He was taller than any other man in Israel, yet at that moment, his height made no difference. In front of Goliath, even he felt small. The fear that gripped the Israelite camp was not only physical, but spiritual. Hearing Goliath's taunts, many began to doubt not only themselves, but also the very God who had delivered them from Egypt, granted them victories over powerful enemies, and promised to protect them. It was as if each word from Goliath pierced the soldiers' souls, reminding them of their weaknesses and uncertainties. But do you know what's most fascinating? This story isn't just about an army paralyzed by fear. It's about how fear can take hold of any one of us. Goliath symbolizes the battles we face every day, challenges that seem insurmountable, voices that tell us we're not good enough. Have you ever felt that way? Ever felt small in the face of something that seemed far greater than you could bear? It was at this moment of paralysis and despair that a new hope emerged. Someone who didn't see Goliath as the invincible giant everyone feared, but as an enemy who could be defeated, not by human strength, but by the power of God. While the Israelite army remained silent, fear written across the faces of its soldiers, a young shepherd tended his sheep in Bethlehem. He was not a warrior, nor someone you would expect to see on the battlefield. David, the youngest of Jesse's sons, lived a simple life deeply connected to God. His days were filled with the hard work of protecting his flock from lions and bears, as well as moments of worship in which he composed psalms that reflected his unshakable faith. He was young and militarily inexperienced, but he possessed something the entire Israelite army lacked: complete trust in the Lord. The story takes a turn when David is sent by his father to the Israelite camp. His mission was straightforward: bring provisions to his brothers and report back on their well-being. But upon arriving, David encountered a scene that would stir anyone: Goliath, as he did daily, shouting his taunts and challenging the Israelites. Yet while everyone else hid and trembled, David reacted entirely differently. He didn't see Goliath as an invincible giant, but as someone insulting the God of Israel. Can you imagine David's audacity? A young man, without military training, physically far weaker than the warriors of his time, hearing the same challenge that had paralyzed the entire Israelite army. At that moment, David shouted with confidence and courage, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine to defy the armies of the living God?" David didn't see just a physical enemy. He saw a spiritual battle, a direct affront to the Lord's name. And that was something he couldn't ignore. David's words quickly reached King Saul, who summoned him for a conversation. And then something remarkable happened. David volunteered to face Goliath. Yes, you read that right. A simple shepherd, armed only with his faith and his experience defending sheep in the field, decided to step forward to fight the Philistines' greatest warrior. Can you imagine Saul's reaction? Surely, he must have thought David was insane. After all, how could someone so young even dream of battling Goliath? But David didn't see impossibilities. He recounted to Saul his experiences fighting lions and bears to protect his flock. He knew that the same hand of God that had delivered him from those beasts would be with him in this challenge. To David, the size of the enemy didn't matter. What truly made a difference was who fought alongside him. He was convinced that God would deliver him once again. David was no ordinary hero. He didn't rely on weapons, military strategies, or his own strength. His courage came from a much greater source, his unshakable faith. And it was that faith that led him to make the decision no one else had the courage to make. He didn't wait for others to rise. He took it upon himself to be God's instrument in that battle. But what could David do against such a powerful enemy? The answer was about to surprise everyone watching. As David prepared to face Goliath, the contrast between the two had never been more striking. On one side stood a young shepherd with no battle experience, no armor, and no sophisticated weapons. On the other was a feared warrior, dressed in the finest armor money could buy, shielded by impenetrable protection, and armed to the teeth. To human eyes, the victory seemed already decided. But for David, appearances didn't matter. He trusted in something far greater than physical strength or weaponry. He trusted in God. When David was brought before Saul, the king insisted that he wear his armor. Can you imagine David, a thin young man, smaller than most soldiers, trying to walk in armor that didn't even fit him? That's exactly what happened. David put on Saul's armor, but quickly realized it wasn't meant for him. He didn't need human protection. He needed only God's presence. Without hesitation, he removed the armor and chose something so simple it might have seemed laughable. His sling and 5 smooth stones he selected from the stream. This choice might seem absurd, but it reveals something profound about David. He knew his strength didn't come from the weapons he used, but from his trust in God. He was absolutely convinced that victory would be his, not because he was stronger or more experienced, but because God was with him. This unwavering confidence set him apart from everyone else in the Israelite camp. While the soldiers saw Goliath as an enemy too formidable to defeat, David saw an opportunity to demonstrate God's power. As David walked onto the battlefield, his steady steps spoke volumes about his faith. Every movement was a testament to his confidence, and his words made it even clearer when he looked at Goliath and said, "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." These words weren't just a statement, they were a prophecy. David wasn't there to fight with his own strength. He knew the battle belonged to the Lord. What's most incredible is that David didn't hesitate for a moment to charge toward Goliath. He didn't stop to measure the giant's height or calculate his chances of success. For David, the only thing that mattered was God's faithfulness. This confidence is a powerful example for you. How often do life's giants make you doubt your abilities or even God's plan for you? David shows us that true strength doesn't come from who we are or what we have, but from who is with us. And as David positioned himself on the battlefield, armed with his sling and just 5 stones, something extraordinary was about to happen. The faith of one young man was about to shake a giant's confidence and change the course of Israel's history forever. The sun shone high over the valley of Elah, illuminating the stage where Israel's destiny would be decided. On one side stood the Philistine army, confident and mocking. On the other, the army of Israel, silent and frozen, fear etched on every soldier's face. And in the middle of the valley, two figures emerged, a giant and a young shepherd. Goliath advanced with heavy steps, each one resounding like thunder. His bronze armor gleamed in the sunlight, and the spear he carried looked more like a weapon of war than something a common man could wield. He laughed, a laugh filled with scorn. "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" he shouted, mocking David, who held only a sling and 5 smooth stones. David, without hesitation, replied firmly, his voice echoing with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone so young. "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today, the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and all will know that there is a God in Israel." The giant laughed again. To him, this was absurd. How could a boy, without armor or proper weapons, dare to face a trained warrior like him? But as Goliath mocked, David began to move. He didn't wait for the giant to strike. Instead, he ran toward his enemy, determination in his eyes, as if he already knew the victory was his. David reached into his pouch and drew out a stone. Quickly, he placed it in his sling, swung it above his head, and launched it with all his might. The sound of the stone cutting through the air was followed by a dull impact. The stone struck Goliath squarely in the forehead, the one vulnerable spot between his armor. The giant paused for a moment, as if unable to believe what had happened, and then collapsed with a thunderous crash that shook the entire valley. Silence fell over the battlefield. It was as if time had stopped. Soldiers on both sides stood in disbelief. Without hesitation, David ran to the giant's body, drew Goliath's sword, a weapon so massive it seemed almost comical in his hands, and used it to confirm the victory. The enemy was defeated. The Israelite army erupted in cheers. David's courage and faith had not only brought down Goliath, but also renewed the morale of the people and their faith in the Lord. David held up Goliath's head as a trophy, not out of vanity, but as a testament that God fights the battles of his people. On that day, Israel did more than win a battle. They rediscovered the power of the God they served, and David, the young shepherd, took his first step toward becoming the greatest king in Israel's history. Now, think about the reaction of the Philistine soldiers. They, who had placed their confidence in Goliath's strength, panicked and fled. Meanwhile, the Israelite army, previously paralyzed by fear, was filled with renewed courage and pursued the enemies, achieving a victory that had seemed impossible just minutes earlier. Do you see how the faith of a single person can transform the situation for an entire people? Another fascinating detail that demonstrates David's complete trust in God is the fact that he picked up only 5 stones. This detail often goes unnoticed. At the time of the confrontation, Goliath's 4 brothers were present in the enemy's ranks. In other words, David was so certain of his victory that he prepared only 4 additional stones, in case Goliath's brothers joined the fight. In essence, 1 stone to bring down the giant Goliath, and 1 stone for each of his brothers. This battle between David and Goliath was not merely a physical confrontation. It was a lesson on the importance of trusting in God, even when everything seems to be against you. David showed that the size of your enemy doesn't matter when you serve a God who is greater than any adversity. Perhaps you faced your own giants, problems that seem impossible to overcome, moments when everyone around you doubted you. David's story reminds us that with faith, any battle can be won. But David's victory was not the end of the story. The Bible makes it clear that Goliath was not the only giant inhabiting the region at the time. He was part of a fascinating yet terrifying lineage. In 2 Samuel 21 verses 15 to 22, we are introduced to Goliath's brothers and other giants who also confronted the Israelites. These imposing figures, known as the Rephaim or descendants of the giants, had characteristics as remarkable as Goliath's, with stories that have been told among the people of Israel to this day. Goliath had at least 4 brothers, all of whom were notorious warriors. One of them, named Lami, is mentioned in 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5. Like Goliath, he wielded a massive spear, showcasing that extraordinary physical strength was a common trait in their family. Another giant, described in 2 Samuel 21 verse 20, had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a total of 24 digits, adding an almost mythical touch to the descriptions of this lineage. But why does the Bible emphasize these giants? They were not merely physical enemies of Israel. They symbolized something much greater. They represented forces opposed to God's plan, challenging the divine promise to give the land to the Israelites. Every encounter with one of these giants was more than a battle. It was a reaffirmation of God's sovereignty over human and spiritual realms. Now, imagine the impact these figures had at the time. For the Israelites, facing a giant was not just a matter of bravery, but of faith. Goliath and his brothers symbolized challenges that seemed insurmountable. Have you ever faced something similar in your life? A problem or obstacle so massive it seemed unsolvable? The story of these giants reminds us that no matter how great the challenges, God always equips those who trust in Him to overcome. Interestingly, David and his warriors also defeated the other giants. This demonstrates that David's courage and faith were passed on to those who followed him. He didn't just face Goliath, but paved the way for others to overcome their personal giants. And what about you? Have you noticed the impact your faith can have on the lives of others? The presence of Goliath and his brothers raises an intriguing question. Where did these giants come from? Their connection to the Nephilim suggests a lineage that dates back to ancient times. The Nephilim, these enigmatic beings, are first mentioned in Genesis 6 verse 4, which states, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." Who were the Nephilim? Could they have been ancestors of Goliath and his brothers? Or is the connection between them something more symbolic and spiritual? The word Nephilim has been translated in various ways over the centuries. Some interpret it as fallen or those who fell, suggesting a link to the fallen angels mentioned in Jude 1 verse 6 and 2 Peter 2 verse 4. This interpretation indicates that the Nephilim might have been the result of a supernatural union between fallen angels and human women. Can you imagine the impact such beings would have had on society at the time? It's no wonder they were described as men of renown. They were remarkable figures, but also bore the mark of rebellion against God. On the other hand, some view the Nephilim in a more natural sense. Certain scholars believe the term refers to a powerful human lineage, such as the descendants of Cain or ancient warrior kings who dominated the early world. This interpretation highlights the Nephilim as extraordinary in strength and abilities, but still entirely human. This perspective explains their presence on earth both before and after the flood, connecting them to later giants like the Rephaim, the Anakim, and, of course, Goliath and his brothers. But why would God allow the existence of beings like the Nephilim? This is a question that has puzzled many theologians. Some suggest they represented a deviation from God's original plan for humanity. They were symbols of corruption and rebellion, which culminated in the flood when God decided to cleanse the earth of widespread wickedness. However, the mention of post-flood giants, such as the Anakim, suggests that this lineage persisted in some form. Can you see how the story of the Nephilim is not only fascinating, but also filled with spiritual implications? They embody the blending of the natural with the supernatural, the human with the divine, challenging us to reflect on the battle between good and evil that permeates the Bible. More than historical figures, the Nephilim serve as a reminder that forces will always attempt to divert humanity from God's plan. But just as David faced Goliath, God continually raises people of faith to conquer these giants. There is still much to uncover about the Nephilim and their connections to the post-flood giants. After all, how did this mysterious lineage survive the flood? What role did the Anakim and other descendants play in the unfolding of biblical history? When we think of the flood, we often imagine a total reset for humanity, with Noah and his family repopulating the earth. But something intriguing occurs in the biblical account. Giants reappear even after the flood. How is this possible? Could the Anakim, the Rephaim, and other post-flood giants have some connection to the mysterious Nephilim mentioned in Genesis? And what does this reveal about God's plan and the forces opposing it? The Anakim are among the most notorious lineages of giants mentioned in the Bible. In Deuteronomy 2 verses 10 to 11, we learn that they inhabited the region of Hebron and were known for their extraordinary height and strength. The word Anakim derives from Anak, which means long neck or giant. These beings were so impressive that in Numbers 13:33, the spies sent by Moses to explore the land of Canaan returned terrified, saying, "We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." This reaction of fear reveals the visual and psychological impact the giants had on those who faced them. But the Anakim were not the only giants who survived or reappeared after the flood. The Rephaim, mentioned in Deuteronomy 3 verse 11, were also renowned for their height and strength. An example is Og, king of Bashan, whose iron bed measured about 4 meters long and 2 meters wide. He was defeated by the Israelites under Moses' leadership, demonstrating that despite their imposing stature, even these giants could not withstand God's power. Now you might be wondering, how did these giants survive the flood? The Bible does not provide a direct answer, but there are some intriguing theories. One suggests that the lineage of giants might have reemerged through some form of genetic continuity within one of the families that survived the flood. Another possibility is that new giants arose through supernatural events similar to those described in Genesis 6, where the sons of God again intermingled with humans. Whatever the explanation, the fact remains that giants continued to play a significant role in Israel's history. These giants were not just physical threats. They represented resistance to God's plan for Israel. The lands God promised to Abraham were inhabited by these giant peoples, and their presence was a constant reminder that God's people would need faith and courage to fulfill their calling. Every battle against the Anakim, the Rephaim, and other giant descendants was more than a territorial conquest. It was a demonstration that God was with Israel, helping them overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. And do you know what's most amazing? Just as David faced Goliath centuries later, the people of Israel faced and defeated these giants not by their own strength, but through God's faithfulness. This serves as a powerful reminder for you. No matter how big the giants in your life may seem, God is greater and is by your side. But the stories of these giants still leave us with fascinating questions. Were they merely historical figures, or is there a connection to genetic or spiritual phenomena? Biblical giants such as Goliath, the Anakim, and the Rephaim have always intrigued readers and scholars. After all, how can the existence of such extraordinary beings be explained? For those seeking to understand the connections between biblical narratives and real-life events, science and genetics offer some clues that may complement this fascinating story without contradicting the truth of Scripture. A plausible explanation for the existence of giants is tied to known medical conditions such as gigantism and acromegaly. Gigantism results from an overproduction of growth hormone during childhood, usually due to a tumor in the pituitary gland. Acromegaly, on the other hand, occurs in adulthood and causes exaggerated growth of extremities and organs. These medical conditions could explain how Goliath and other giants reached impressive heights and developed extraordinary physical strength. However, these diseases often come with physical limitations, such as difficulty moving and impaired vision, aspects not directly mentioned in biblical descriptions. But are these medical details enough to explain everything? Perhaps not. There is also the possibility that these giants were the result of rare genetic variations or specific lineages that emerged in certain historical periods. Did you know that even today, there are accounts and archaeological evidence of ancient peoples with average heights well above the norm? For instance, in regions like the Middle East and Europe, archaeologists have uncovered human skeletons that far exceeded the average height of their time. Now, consider the biblical perspective. Giants are not just depicted as imposing physical figures, but also as spiritual symbols. Their presence in biblical narratives is often associated with opposition to God's plan. This raises an interesting question. Could these giants have been more than just humans? Some scholars suggest their origins may be linked to the Nephilim mentioned in Genesis 6. The controversy surrounding giants also extends to their lineage and survival after the flood. Genetics or supernatural intervention? This question remains unanswered. One intriguing theory is that the giant lineages could have persisted through specific genetic mutations in surviving populations. Another hypothesis points to a new supernatural intervention, something similar to what occurred before the flood. And what about historical and cultural accounts? Giants are not exclusive to the Bible. Myths and legends from various cultures mention beings of extraordinary stature, such as the Titans of Greek mythology or the Jotnar of Norse mythology. These stories, though different in detail, reveal a universal theme: the existence of giant figures that dominated the collective imagination and were associated with epic challenges. For readers of the Bible, these connections reinforce the uniqueness of the sacred text, which not only narrates history but also provides spiritual meaning to these events. By connecting science, genetics, and spirituality, the story of biblical giants gains even greater depth. Do you see how these figures, whether interpreted as natural phenomena or supernatural beings, continue to teach us lessons about faith, overcoming obstacles, and the battle between good and evil? David's victory over Goliath is much more than a story of triumph. It is a narrative that transcends centuries, bringing profound lessons about faith, courage, and purpose. When you think of this confrontation, you might picture a young shepherd facing an invincible giant. But the truth is, this moment carries spiritual symbolism that extends far beyond the battlefield. This story is about you, the challenges you face, and how God acts in the most unlikely situations. David, small and seemingly fragile, represents those who trust in God even when the odds appear stacked against them. He was neither the strongest nor the most experienced, but he had something Goliath lacked: unwavering faith. For David, the size of the enemy or the weapons he wielded didn't matter. What truly mattered was the God who fought for him. This is the first great lesson for you. No matter how big the giant you're facing, whether it's financial difficulties, health problems, or even a crisis of faith, you too can overcome when you place your trust in the Lord. David's action of picking up a simple sling and 5 smooth stones symbolizes the simplicity and effectiveness of trusting in the resources God provides. Perhaps you felt inadequate or ill-equipped to face something in your life. But remember that David didn't need sophisticated armor or a powerful sword. He used what he had, trusting that God would do the rest. This is another powerful lesson. God will never ask more of you than what you already have. He uses what is in your hands to accomplish great things. Goliath's defeat was not just a personal victory for David. It marked a spiritual turning point for Israel. The army, once paralyzed by fear, was now filled with courage, pursuing the Philistines and defeating them completely. The impact of David's faith extended beyond himself, inspiring the entire nation. This invites reflection. How can your faith inspire and encourage those around you? Like David, you can be a catalyst for transformation in your family, community, or church. Furthermore, the story of David and Goliath reminds us that God chooses the unlikely. David was the youngest among his brothers, dismissed because of his youth and lack of experience. Yet he was the one God chose to defeat the giant. This teaches us that God does not see as humans see. He looks at the heart, the willingness, and the faith. Perhaps you've been underestimated or even doubted yourself. But remember, God equips you to overcome any challenge, no matter how great it seems. Now think about how this victory resonates in our lives today. What do the giants we face symbolize? Perhaps they are fears, doubts, or situations that feel beyond our control. David's story challenges you to view these challenges differently. It's not about how big the problem is, but how great the God is who fights for you. But the influence of this story doesn't stop here. It transcends time and culture, inspiring generations around the world. The influence of the Nephilim and biblical giants extends far beyond the pages of the Bible. These imposing and mysterious figures have inspired mythologies, legends, and narratives in cultures worldwide. The idea of gigantic, powerful, and often dangerous beings resonates universally, connecting different traditions and reinforcing the timeless relevance of these stories. For instance, the Greeks had the Titans, giants who ruled before the Olympian gods. These figures were associated with brute strength and chaos, characteristics that echo the descriptions of biblical giants. In Norse mythology, the Jotnar, or frost giants, played a similar role, frequently opposing the gods and representing primal forces of nature. To you, this may seem like mere coincidence, but these similarities reveal how the concept of giants transcends cultures and eras. And it's not just myths that reflect the influence of biblical giants. Literary and artistic works have also been deeply impacted by these narratives. Think, for example, of stories like Jack and the Beanstalk, which involves a confrontation between a young boy and a giant. Or The Lord of the Rings, where trolls and other colossal beings evoke the fear and fascination that giants have always inspired. Even in films like Godzilla, we see the concept of giant beings representing forces that challenge humanity. Now, returning to the biblical text, the presence of the Nephilim and giants like Goliath is not just historical, but also spiritual. These beings are not portrayed as heroes, but as symbols of resistance to God's plan. They appear at pivotal moments, such as the conquest of Canaan, testing the faith and courage of God's people. This teaches us that just as biblical giants challenged the Israelites, there are symbolic giants that continue to challenge our faith today. These could be personal difficulties, spiritual doubts, or even cultural influences attempting to draw us away from God's purpose. What about science? It, too, contributes to the conversation. Many cultures have left records of enormous bones, raising questions about how these findings connect to biblical accounts. Some suggest that these remains are evidence that giants truly existed. Others believe that such discoveries, while intriguing, may have natural explanations. Regardless, these findings continue to fuel fascination with these extraordinary beings. The impact of the Nephilim and giants extends beyond the religious context. They invite us to reflect on our own struggles between good and evil, faith and doubt, the human and the divine. They remind us that just as David faced Goliath, each of us has our own giants to confront. These stories, though ancient, continue to inspire us, bridging the past with the present and showing us that, with God, no challenge is too great.